Welcome to the studios at Michigan Realtors. We are here for the conversation. It's a focus on the future of our industry. I'm Sandy Smith, and I'm the 2024 president of Michigan Realtors.
Oh, thanks, Sandy. And I'm Brian Western. I'm the general counsel for Michigan Realtors.
I'm Becky Burke. I am the Director of Education here at Michigan Realtors, and I am happy to be here with both of you, part of the conversation. So, what do you have for us, Sandy?
Well, let's dive right in. I've got a number of questions that seem to keep bubbling up to the top, and we're going to start with the scope of the settlement. Who is covered by the settlement and the release of liability?
I think that's a good place to start because the release of liability is a really big piece of all of this. So the release of liability applies to NAR. It includes all realtor members. It includes state and local realtor associations, realtor-owned MLSs, and any brokerage that had a residential transaction volume above $2 billion in the year 2022. So that means that the unincluded groups for the release of liability would be the non-realtor MLSs and then the brokerages over that $2 billion transaction mark. But it is important to note that those excluded groups were given an opt-in method to get excluded or released from liability if they choose to.
Yeah, and it's important to note that many of those realtor brokerages that had that threshold in excess of the $2 billion mark have already engaged in their own settlement discussions. In some instances, if they have chosen not to opt in, they are working out their own collective settlement, based on their individual circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And is there any action that I need to take to be covered, or do realtors need to sign something?
No, that's the good news. That's probably the easiest part of all of this. If you are an individual or an entity that was released from liability, you don't have to do anything. There's nothing to sign up for. You're just automatically included in that release.
Yeah. And that's a good thing because the deadline to opt in has recently passed, so June 18th.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. So as long as I maintain my membership, I'm covered.
Yes, and comply with the terms of the settlement. Like no bad behavior, but
fair.
If you toe the line, then you're still released from liability.
I think that will be a really important overarching thesis for this conversation is when we talk about the settlement and the terms of the settlement, making sure that in the back of everybody's mind is compliance with the settlement, because that is what the settlement demands. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what are the primary practice changes that are going to be required by the settlement? And what is the we already talked about the implementation date.
Yeah, so there are, aside from the release of liability, there are really two big practice changes that the settlement brings forth. The first is that beginning August 17th, you cannot make offers of compensation through the MLS. The second big practice change is that realtors will have to have some kind of written agreement in place with a buyer before they tour a property with that buyer. Those are the two big changes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we've been talking a lot about the practice changes. We've done a variety of different letters of the law and from the mailbags that have touched on those practice changes. But still we get questions. And some of them, I think it's important for us to dispel during this discussion because we're starting to hear things like, well, if offers of compensation are no longer allowed, then what do we do? How do we communicate? Well, they're not allowed on the MLS, but what that does is it places an extreme premium on communication between brokerages off MLS. The spirit of cooperation that we've long discussed in the world of realtors is a key because that cooperation is always engineered to benefit the client and make sure that the standard that we all talk about as realtors is upheld. So yes, you can communicate and you can discuss what is being offered by a listing brokerage, and you can request information about that, and we'll talk a lot about the different varieties of ways that you can serve your seller and your buyer.
Okay, so compensation absolutely can still be shared with buyer brokers. And is it true that buyer's agents can only be paid once they've agreed to receive their buyer's agency, what they've agreed to in their buyer agency contract?
So it's an important question because we've discussed obviously the requirement to have a written agreement, and that written agreement needn't be an agency agreement. But it does have to, the two triggers are obviously that you're working with a buyer and that you're touring a property or touring a residential property. The likelihood that showing agreement or potentially non-agency agreement moves into agency will be very important, because obviously in order for a buyer brokerage to be on the best footing and for that client to also receive the full spectrum of services, you want to have an agency agreement in place.
Right, and that agency agreement, or whatever written agreement might be in place, it does have to specify what that buyer's agent is going to be paid, and that's kind of, I think, the heart of what the lawsuit was all about, is putting in writing what a buyer's agent is going to be paid.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know why you wouldn't
Right.
start out a relationship that way
Right.
anyways. And Brian, I noticed you said residential. This only applies to residential.
Yeah, that's an important point in 1 to 4. And I think that when we discuss the scope of the written agreement, it's really important to make sure that we're talking about compensation in the showing environment. The showing agreement that Michigan Realtors is developing and will push out to membership and local associations in the near future contemplates that you may receive compensation through the brokerage on a showing by showing basis, but that could be credited to any agency agreement that you engage in thereafter. So the idea of really empowering those buyers, making sure that they understand the terms by which they engage in the real estate market, especially getting off on the right foot. You may find a situation where a buyer is not really comfortable signing an exclusive buyer brokerage contract right out of the gate, and I can understand that. But at the same time, for those brokerages that are in a great position to have these strong consultations that look a lot like the listing agreement, the listing appointments, they're in a position to walk that prospective buyer through the process, figure out exactly what the words on the page mean, and also discuss the scope of service. Because I think what's going to distinguish buyer brokerages that really thrive in this new environment will be that ability to convey the value in the hustle through that initial consultation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. That's something we've long practiced in our agency, and I think the buyers really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Now here's a big question. If the compensation field is being removed from the MLS, then how will this information, the broker compensation, how will that be communicated?
There are, a lot of ways that the compensation can be communicated. And I think that's one thing that we really wanted to make sure that everyone understood, or, as a takeaway from this conversation, is just because offers of compensation are leaving the MLS does not mean that they cannot be communicated in other ways. And the big way is just agents are going to be relying really heavily on direct communication, with each other, texts, calls, emails to the listing broker, asking what compensation, if any, is being offered on the property. And I know that, I will say with the caveat, I understand Brian and I both know that, it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, just call the listing agent and ask what's being offered. That's really easy for us to say. But it really is going to be this new way of doing business. And I think that agents are really going to have to lean into that direct communication with each other.
And I think, some of the anchor phrases that we've discussed as we've talked about the settlement really kind of comes down to a back to basics approach. What would you do if you didn't have the perfect machinery in place to communicate compensation? And we can argue all day long that the MLS is still the most efficient way to communicate levels of compensation or create exposure for the property. We still believe that to be true when it comes to advertising property and making sure that people are set up to communicate. But when it comes down to different ways that brokerages can communicate about compensation, there's the sky's the limit. I mean, we've already seen discussions from brokerages where they entertain utilization of QR codes on signage, certainly those direct communications. It's probably an area that not only demands professionalism in greater degree, but also sets us up for that development and fostering greater professionalism.
And I hear you both, but I'm going to poke you a little bit.
Please do.
So what happens when the other agent doesn't respond to you?
Yeah, obviously, this is an age-old question. It has nothing to do with the settlement. And NAR has sought to address this in different ways over the last several years. Has my offer been submitted? I can't get the agent to respond to me. Obviously, the MLS is in the position of enforcement. Because you are required to cooperate, and if it is very clear that you are not engaged in any type of cooperation and non-responsive, that's where I think the MLS does come in. Certainly complaints can be filed, but one of the other pieces to that is it's also going to really depend upon the relationships and the ability for brokerages to create that sense of, okay, well, before we even are representing a client, I know this brokerage. I've really kind of established myself as a piece of this local market. They understand who I am. They respect who I am. Those types of relationships, I think, will be key to sort of ameliorate that concern. But we understand it's out there, and obviously the compliance piece is going to be extremely important.
Right. And on the topic of compliance, I mean, remember too that, the Realtor Code of Ethics requires agents to act in the best interests of their clients, as does Michigan state law, through our fiduciary duties and years of case law. So, none of that is changing. A listing agent still has the ethical duty, the legal duty to act solely in the best interests of their client. So if I'm a listing agent and if I'm not responding to, questions that buyers agents are bringing to me, whether it be about compensation or anything else, right, about the property, I think there's a strong argument there that I'm not looking out for the best interests of my client.
Sure. Now you both have touched on forms and enforcement, so we'll come back to that. But I want to know some other more finite pieces of how we're going to do this communication and what might be allowed. Remarks in the MLS, coded remarks in the MLS.
Yeah.
Please don't.
Don't do it.
Please don't do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Please. Just please don't
No
do that. Yeah.
series of codes, numbers, and letters. That's not allowed.
So what everybody has to remember about this is that any communication of compensation through the MLS is not allowed. So that would include the agent remarks. That would include we've seen all kinds of interesting little videos and suggested workarounds online where you have a pillow maybe that spells out however much, compensation is being offered, don't get cute with it. You can't do that stuff.
Yeah. And it's important to note that we recognize that a lot of that is parody. A lot of that is
Frustration.
coping mechanism, if you will, because it goes without saying that a lot of what we're talking about right now is anxiety inducing. And that's why we're having the conversation. But the idea that we should approach this in ways that in any way is engineered to work around the spirit and the letter of the settlement, I think is wrong-headed. The MLSs are in a very unenviable position to be charged with enforcement. And to the extent that information on the MLS is being utilized improperly, but also that those feeds that come from the MLS, those feeds.
So like a showing service or an IDX maybe?
Yeah.
Right. The terms of the settlement are really clear on this too. Like the MLS cannot allow its data feed to be used in any way that would convey an offer of compensation. So, using the showing platform or other portals or platforms or anything that pulls information from the MLS data feed cannot be used to convey offers of compensation, period.
So I could put it on my listings on my website.
Right.
I could put it on a sign rider on the house or at an open
QR
house
code.
balloon. I can do all those things, but it's only my
listings.
listing.
Right,
Yeah.
for your listings, yes. But if you're doing that for other listings, say on your, public-facing brokerage website, if you, use the MLS data feed to display listings on your website, you can state offers of compensation for your own listings. That's totally okay. You can't do it, though, for other brokers' listings.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to note that, what that sets up is if you are in any way characterized as an aggregator of that data or sort of a proxy MLS, not only is it a violation of the settlement, but I think it opens up additional liabilities because the plaintiff's attorneys and those that are monitoring this issue are watching it very closely.
Yeah, on that note, and it's sort of a word of caution, I guess. We've also heard chatter about agents maybe banding together and just creating their own platform where they all input what offers of compensation they're offering on certain properties, and I suppose that you could argue that if you're not directly pulling from the MLS data feed, if it's based on broker load, then maybe it would be okay, but the Department of Justice and the plaintiff's attorneys have made it very clear that would be the target for the next lawsuit. So highly inadvisable to
Well,
go
like in
that
a
route.
mastermind group, could you put out all your current listings on a table with a compensation code on it?
Yes.
As your listing?
As far as I, at least my mind, whenever I think of social media, I think of the anti-social media.
I was thinking about an in-person event.
An in-person event. Well, if you're collaborating, and certainly I think the rubber meets the road when it comes to how it operates. I mean, if it's a group of brokerages that are collaborating and sort of a mastermind way, I think the concern obviously is how exclusive it is, and I just think that as we navigate this right now, and NAR has been trying to stay as conservative as possible about its
Understood.
interpretation, that anything that's too far afield from the spirit and the letter of the settlement is not advisable.
So just don't do it.
No, I think the opportunities that are presented by the settlement are golden. I mean, I think that's where a brokerage that does a really good job of not only utilizing the MLS to continue to advertise properties and network with other brokerages, but also the scope of their own advertising prowess, I think, is on display right now, and that's the opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Being innovative is good right now, but also being innovative within the scope of the settlement.
And can this the compensation for a buyer's agent, can that be negotiated through the purchase agreement?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is one that we get a lot. The answer is yes, it can. If a buyer has, an obligation to pay their buyer broker, X amount, it is perfectly legal and okay for them to try to offset that financial obligation by, asking the seller to, pick that up and pay that. And I think that where everybody gets kind of confused on this is that the Realtor Code of Ethics, we have Article 16, I think it is, that says that a buyer's agent cannot use a purchase agreement to try to change what compensation a listing broker is offering through the MLS. But that's not what we're talking about here, because if a buyer and their agent have some kind of written agreement in place where the buyer says, this is what you're going to get paid, that amount's already established. We're not negotiating how much is going to be paid. We're just negotiating who is going to pay that amount.
Right. Yeah, and it's no different than historically as we've understood when a buyer has any kind of obligation, or they're trying to negotiate away an obligation, they will, with a skilled buyer broker, seek to use that in the terms of the offer. Whether it's title insurance or whether it's some form of concessions, those are all examples of this very situation. So, but again, that highlights something that we're going to be talking a lot about over the next 40 minutes or so, is the importance of these contracts. Not only the contract that buyer brokers are engaging in with their buyer clients, sellers with their listing brokers, but also brokers and brokers. So we're going to be talking a lot about how pivotal the contract is, because as we've sort of set up as the overarching theme here, this is going to demand a real increase in professionalism and a real high standard for communication.
So this was an effort, the lawsuit was an effort to create some transparency in compensation. And one of the things I hear over and over again is it feels like it's a lack of transparency now. And what you've just been telling me is that it's going to take extraordinary efforts or extra efforts, maybe not extraordinary, to discover what that compensation may be on each individual listing. How do you
Yeah.
wrestle with that?
Yeah, I think that the discussion about transparency or a lack thereof, I don't disagree that the settlement and certainly the lawsuits as they've unfolded have created a situation where potentially you have a lack of transparency. But what I do think is important is for brokerages, as they cooperate and as they work with their clients, they establish a different kind of transparency, which kind of gets back to this idea of how well are you empowering your client? How much do they understand? Because that's transparency. And that's probably the most direct type of transparency, because you're actually sitting down with that buyer client and saying, this is why you don't look no further. This is the buyer brokerage for you, or this is who you want to list your property with, because you've put it out there on the table for them to understand exactly what's going to happen in all likelihood, and that you're going to be the steward throughout the transaction to make sure that all questions you're one step ahead of. So I think that that's where the new kind of transparency comes in. But I understand that the MLS and the utility of the MLS, when offers of compensation were allowed on the MLS, that was an extremely transparent process. And obviously we're not relitigating the lawsuits, but that being said, the opportunity is to redefine transparency, I think.
So, how does this affect procuring cause?
It's a mighty good question, Cindy. And that's where we get into the contracts. I mean, I think that it's pivotal that we all understand that one of the other really strong pieces to the MLS was that when you did make an offer of compensation through the MLS, you were making that offer of compensation to all participants. And that the idea of a participant working with a buyer in Michigan, we don't have mandatory buyer brokerage contracts. So the contract was not necessarily the end-all be-all to prove that you were the quote-unquote procuring cause. Now, I think that in all likelihood, you can look really no further than the contract. I mean, there may be some extenuating circumstances, but the standards of procuring cause and the need to arbitrate, which will still be in place, they're going to be leaning very heavily on the contract. Not only the contract that you have with the buyer client, but certainly the contract that you have with the cooperating broker. So it's going to be a bit of a sea change because in other states where they don't have mandatory buyer brokerage, or they have a history of broker-to-broker agreements, these types of agreements have been a formality for a long time. In Michigan, and we've discussed it in the most recent letter of the laws, there will be, I think, a best practice that develops where if a broker, listing broker, is offering compensation, it needs to be done in a very direct and detailed manner. You can't just casually, offer compensation out there without the ways that you earn it, because the danger, obviously, is that in Michigan, conversations and promises between brokerages, they can be binding if they're oral. And we want to make sure that from a best practice perspective, listing brokerages are laying out the criteria on how you earn cooperating compensation that the seller has authorized. And from the buyer's side, that buyer brokers understand exactly how the process works, and on behalf of their buyer client, trying to defray any obligation that buyer may have. So.
Sure. And our very own Brad Ward will be over across the Capitol working towards making some changes. Can you touch on that for just a little bit?
Absolutely.
Changes to Michigan law?
It's important. One of the areas that the settlement has sort of created sort of a weak flank in Michigan and many other states is when you have a high likelihood of implied agency. I mean, we've got this new kind of frontier where we're going to be looking at touring agreements and showing agreements that may be customer service centric, and getting to the point where you've got the defined scope of your agency in Michigan right now, that is a minefield. And working with a person, a buyer, a prospective buyer, as a customer, you want to have that showing agreement outline what it isn't, because it is not an agency agreement. And you want to make sure that you are repeating. I can't offer you agency services through this. It's a customer service relationship. But the problem is that that's paper. And then there are practices. And when we get into the issue of implied agency, you want to be able to define exactly when your agency starts and when it is a customer's relationship. So Brad is going to be working with the government affairs team in developing, at the urging of the public policy committee, that jumping off point. Because right now, there are a few different states that have adopted this. You do not have agency unless you have a signed buyer brokerage contract. And that, to, I think, the public policy committee, and certainly to the lawyers in the office, makes a lot of sense. Because when you're thinking about, how you have a conversation with a buyer client, yes, we can work together in a customer service relationship out of the gate to make sure that we enjoy each other's company, that we want to work together. But it's important for them to understand that by law, that I cannot offer you agency services until this point that we have this signed. Not only is that easier to talk about the scope of agency, but also I think distinguishing between customer service and what true agency is.
It also protects the agent a little bit too, doesn't it? It just talks about what we are not.
Yeah, it's the key. I mean, making sure that you have not only, we talk about agency disclosure, right? In Michigan, we've always said that form is as much of a teachable document as it is a liability shield. This is no different. To be able to say that because state law demands agency to be established by contract, that I can't go over that line unless we've formalized it. And that's very important.
Right. And I mean, it's protecting the agent, but I think also it's making it much more clear for the consumer also. A lot of these settlement changes are all geared at, consumer centrism, really protecting the consumer and making sure that they understand what is going on in a transaction. And if we can make that change in Michigan law, like Brian said, it protects the brokerage, but I think it also makes it so much more clear for the consumer on what their relationship is with their, their real estate professional.
Setting expectations.
Right,
Yeah.
Exactly.
And managing them. I think it sets up, it also supports this discussion of a new kind of transparency that we've been talking about.
So that's procuring cause. How about wrapping this buyer's agent fee into the loan? Will lenders allow this?
That's a good question. That's something that we've heard quite often. And as of right now, no. That fee cannot be wrapped up into the loan. Could that change at some point? Maybe. But right now, that's the rule. Yeah. And I think that, a lot of us would agree that that's kind of always what it's been, but it can't do it.
Yeah.
Okay. The veteran buyers, they have always been prohibited from paying fees on the loans. Now, is this something are they going to be able to pay a buyer's agent fee?
Yes. So that was some good news we got a couple weeks ago. The VA agreed to suspend those prohibitions on allowing a veteran buyer to directly compensate their buyer agent, and that was welcome news. It was, music to everybody's ears. When the settlement was first announced, that was one of the really big concerns, was that this was really going to harm veteran buyers, and nobody wants vets to be boxed out of the home buying process. So it was really great news to hear that those rules were being suspended. I believe that the VA is going to engage in a formal rulemaking process, but until they do that, that ban is lifted.
So it's temporary, but we're looking to make that permanent.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's important to highlight. I know there's been some criticism of NAR, of associations in general, as it relates to why be a realtor. Well, the advocacy side of NAR, Michigan Realtors, your local associations, is still extremely powerful. And this is a conversation that NAR has been having with the VA and certainly other financial products that the government sponsors to make sure that they're a step ahead. And this was a heavy lift. I mean, to make sure that they understood it would be a real slap in the face to our veterans to have this all set up for them to engage in a process where it didn't support them. So kudos to NAR for brokering that and working through that process. Obviously, as we've said in the past, it's going to be incumbent on associations like Michigan Realtors and like NAR to continue to show value, to make sure that they are sort of the guideposts on professionalism and education, making sure that when questions are asked, we get those answers. When change is demanded, that we put that advocacy tool to test.
And that kind of leads me to concessions, because some of these can be wrapped up in, the fees can be wrapped up in closing costs, title insurance, prorations, buyer broker fees. Is that?
Yeah, it's
right?
important. Yeah, it's important to understand that we're looking into the future right now. August 17th, maybe before that, where the compensation field will no longer be on the MLS, but that in all likelihood there will be a concessions field. And it's important to also note that the settlement says that concessions ought not to be used solely for the purposes of paying brokerage fees. But that does not mean that concessions that have been authorized by the seller, because again, we get to this point of transparency where the listing broker has had a very impactful and meaningful conversation, listing agent with the seller, where they understand that it makes all the sense in the world to utilize all and understand all the tools at their disposal for marketing that property. And depending on what kind of market you're in, depending on the type of inventory situation or the types of buyers that have become interested in the property, it may make really strong sense for them to put an openness and a willingness to entertain concession requests in the MLS. The issue will obviously be in the practice to make sure that it's done in an appropriate way, that it is seller directed. And again, on the buyer side, that buyer understands the array of different negotiation approaches that they can engage in. Because right now, there is discussion about, well, what is the concession? What's the difference between a concession and the compensation field? Well, obviously, it's a direct invitation from the seller that they're open to it. It's not binding. And that, depending on the offer, depending on other aspects of the deal, they may say, not in this offer. So it's important, I think, for the scope of concessions to be widely understood to not just include brokerage services, but obviously concessions have been something that has been in the realtor world for a long time.
And I mean, you said this already, but just making sure that if the MLS is allowing a concession field, because that's up to local MLS discretion. Some might have a concession field, some might not. Some might have a concession field that is simply, a yes, no, maybe, or maybe it could be, an actual value. But I do think that it's really going to be crucial that realtors are using that concession field appropriately if it's allowed, because if it gets to a point down the road where the data matches up, that the concessions entered into the concession field on the MLS always match up with the compensation offered to the buyer's broker, then we're going to have a problem, and then maybe the MLSs will sort of backtrack and maybe take that concession field away. But using the concession field as a proxy to communicate just straight compensation is a no-go.
And distinctly two different things: compensation
Absolutely.
and concession. However, compensation may be a component of the concession, is what I'm hearing. And it is a conversation then with a seller client to say it probably behooves you to make your property available to as many possible buyers as you can, and this is an opportunity here. Would you like to to explore that a little bit more?
Right, and then it will be up to the seller to say, yes, I want to do that, or no, I want to do that. And then it will be up to a buyer to say, yes, I want to see certain properties, or no, I do not want to see certain properties. I think it's going to really be like on the consumer to make those decisions.
And so the crux of the settlement would be that there was maybe an implication that the agents were doing that filtering or sorting, not the buyer, not the buyer clients.
That was certainly the allegation, but while we don't believe that to be true, it has led to terms in the settlement that we're all seeking to adhere to at this point. I also think it's important that irrespective of whether there's a concessions field in the MLS, that's still the same tool it always has been. So when you are laying out the different options to your buyer client, the buyer client who's unnerved because they don't have two pennies to rub together, they're really nervous about having to pay for brokerage services, you're in a position as that buyer specialist and that buyer brokerage, training it to empower that buyer, to make sure they understand and meet them where they are about that process, whether it's, okay, well, you may become interested in a property that's not offering compensation, but throughout that process, you can ask that seller to offer concessions in some amount. It doesn't need to be advertised in the MLS for you to be aware of that. You just need to know that that's a tool in your toolbox. So I think that, the thought process that we're all going through right now is, where do we go next? But a lot of these have already been there. And these are discussions that, as we go with this back to basics sort of thought process, we shouldn't leave anything off the table. I mean, that are on the table. We should be really educating both the seller and the buyer to counter that allegation, which is, it's just the brokerages that are moving in these directions. It ought not to be, and we argue that it has not been in the past, but certainly now, those types of conversations where a buyer client becomes a buyer client because of the way you've discussed these things.
Right. I think there's going to be so much emphasis on that buyer client education and having just very clear, transparent, candid conversations with the buyer about what services the buyer agent is providing and the cost of those services, and the agents, learning how to communicate this and learning how to articulate everything that they do on behalf of a buyer client. I think to a lot of agents out there, this stuff is all just so second nature. They know what it takes to get a transaction from start to the closing table. But nobody's ever really been in a position where they've been asked to explain that process from start to finish to a client. So I think really getting good at explaining everything that they're doing behind the scenes to get that buyer to a closing table is really going to be huge, and it's going to make the difference between successful agents and unsuccessful
agents. I think part of the magic maybe used to be presto, it's done.
Watch me go.
Right.
I don't know, take it all the concerns away, but now it's kind of pulling back the curtain and seeing the workings.
Look at what I do for you.
Yeah, and obviously there's been some fun made of it, but the multiple lists of all the things that buyer brokers do and listing brokers do on behalf of clients, but it's important. I think it's important to be able to show your work, and I think it's the way to distinguish in what has been and certainly will become even more so competitive.
Yep. And it's a kind of a great way to go into written agreements, because that's really what it boils down to, right? So what triggers the requirements to have the written agreement in place?
Yeah, so there are two sort of things that trigger the requirement to have that written agreement in place. One is touring a property. Touring also includes an agent who does a virtual tour of the property, so I think it's important to note that. And then the second thing is working with a buyer, meaning offering, buyer brokerage services. So, identifying properties, arranging tours, negotiating, writing the offers. Those are all considered, buyer brokerage services that would fall under that working with the buyer category, which would, trigger the need to have that written agreement in place.
So back to what you were saying with the implied agency, this is where you really need to put this in writing.
Yeah, I think it gives us heartburn, but I think it should give brokerages a lot of heartburn, because this idea that we have to change the narrative. I mean, there is a narrative out there where buyer brokerage services is a freebie, and it ought not to be. I mean, the most skilled buyers specialists and buyers brokers out there are really trained in negotiation and obviously time management. Because right now, with limited inventory and the ability to work quickly and communicate in a way that is meaningful and hopefully persuasive for those listings is a paramount consideration. So when we've talked about the need for brokerage contracts, it's twofold. It's based on obviously how will I enforce payment, because statute of frauds requires that in order to enforce an obligation with a client, you have to have a signed agreement. And then also, we have to make very clear that my scope of agency and my value proposition is outlined in this document and the discussion that is sort of follows with it. Making sure that a buyer understands the scope of service and really recognizes the value proposition. It's not lip service. I mean, it is the first step in changing this narrative, making sure that when people think, well, I'm interested in buying a house, they're not thinking about, well, I'm going to be unrepresented, I'm just going to go show up at open houses. I'm going to reach out to somebody who's proven in the community, somebody who's got a great reputation, and I'm going to sit down with them for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever it is and talk about why I should be working with a buyer broker. So.
And does that have to be an exclusive agreement?
No, it does not. And that was one thing that we wanted to make very clear also, because that was causing some panic, I think, among the masses. This written agreement requirement, it does not have to be a full exclusive buyer agency contract. It can be something less. It could be a single day showing. It could be a form simply to show one specific property. It could be a simple, touring agreement, which would maybe be more of like just a customer service relationship, but it does not have to be the full exclusive agency agreement.
Yeah, and it's important to note that when we talk about exclusive agency, that's customizable. And we've talked about, this is all going to be a matter of brokerage policy and brokerage preference, how they want to go about this. But the idea of meeting the buyer client where they are, they may well be comfortable talking about agency and working with you in an agency capacity for a day, for a week, for a specific property. All of those things are opportunities for, I think, a buyer brokerage and the buyer agent to have that conversation. Say, I understand your hesitation, but this is why it's important, and this is how we can customize it to suit your needs. And that's where, this common understanding of, exclusive agency has this intimidating vibe to it. But with revised buyer brokerage contract, and certainly the one that will be ushered out in mid-July, it's all geared towards meeting that client where they are. And if they want to, limit the buyer brokerage, the scope of buyer agency to a neighborhood or a county or a specific time frame, they can do that.
And specific property. And could you have one for each property you showed?
Yeah, I think it's important. I think for the transparency purpose, if it's buyer driven, you certainly can. So buyer says, okay, I'm comfortable engaging in a buyer brokerage contract with you as we pursue this property. The same may not be the case. They say, I'm not ready to go beyond that yet, but then later they are. That would be an example where they would enter into another contract or amend the other one. But I think it's really important to always come back to the fact that, we talk about kind of anchor considerations. Anchor considerations would be that when I'm having these conversations with a buyer, making sure that they're fully aware of how this process works. And if it's, okay, we might not win on this one, but if you like working with me, we can go through this again with a subsequent contract.
Right. And moving forward, I think we could argue that this has always been the case, but it's not going to be enough to just email the buyer some form and say, here, sign this so that I can show you a property. It is going to require some thought. It's going to require some transparency, clear conversations. And like Brian, I'm going to keep coming back to the phrase that you're using, is to meet the buyer where they are. Because this isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all approach for every single buyer. It could look different.
Sure.
Yeah, so when we talk about the settlement requirements for the buyer agreement or the written agreement, obviously, traditionally, a buyer brokerage contract is going to include those aspects, but it's also important that as brokerages are revising their contracts, that they also have that that very clear language, which I think you probably learned to quote pretty well.
Yes, that broker commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable.
Yep.
It does have to have that language in it. The written agreements do also have to specify what amount of compensation the buyer's broker is going to be paid. And that amount of compensation, I mean, it can be anything you want. It can be, a commission that's based on a percentage of the purchase price. It could be a flat fee. It could be a retainer fee, an hourly fee.
Yep.
It can be whatever you want, but it does have to be in that written agreement.
Yeah, and it also, in terms of other parties involved in the compensation, it has to be very specific to the buyer brokerage contract. It can't be, a bonus from that sort of a situation. That's something that if you haven't, obviously we've been talking a lot about the NAR FAQs and sort of parsing them and sending other emails to NAR to say, what do you mean by this? And one thing that is clear as you review the FAQs is that part of the settlement really does require specificity in that agreement and how you're getting paid. So.
Okay. 4 services that are clearly identified.
Correct.
Yeah, and that's a really good prompt because one thing that we would point out is, there's been discussion around the concept of, well, can I have a buyer brokerage contract that contemplates the obligation for my buyer, but also what that obligation looks like if there is compensation offered. That agreement ought not to have that 2-tiered approach because it's very important to understand that you're negotiating with the buyer relative to services, relative to the services offered, relative to your licensed profession. And the idea that you would have a diminution in value or an increase in value based on where the money's coming from, that's problematic under the settlement. And that question has been raised with NAR directly because of some of the FAQs, and they've made it very clear that a 2-tiered approach there isn't acceptable. So what we do encourage people to do, obviously, is make sure that any change to a contract, any amendment going forward, because as we mentioned, you may start with a customer-centric showing form, and you may move into a single property buyer brokerage form, and then something that becomes a little bit more robust. Each of those contracts can have different fee structures. So it's always going to be important to have it, buyer-led, but also very clearly identified in the contract.
Meet the buyer where they are.
Meet the buyer where they are.
All right. And will I be turning in these written agreements with the buyer with my offers?
Oh, it's the hall pass. No. Yeah,
That's a good question. It's not required by the terms of the settlement. The MLS could request to see copies of those written agreements with the buyers, for compliance purposes. But there's nothing in these new rules that says that, before I take my buyer to a showing, I have to, present proof of my written agreement to, the listing agent. So, it's not the listing agent that is charged with enforcing this written agreement requirement. It's not the local association. It is the MLS.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And what about open houses? And there's unrepresented buyers coming in. How does that get handled?
Yeah, I think we go back to this idea of Michigan law. We never want to forget that we have agency disclosure laws here, and it's very important because it is a shield, because it's very important for brokerages to put up that stop sign when an unrepresented buyer tries to sort of tiptoe that line of, well, am I implied agency questions, and obviously that could raise the question of undisclosed dual agency. But one thing that is clear is that with an open house, where the seller and listing broker have agreed to open up the property to unrepresented buyers or anyone who comes through, that does not trigger a requirement on the listing broker or listing agent to have written agreements with any of the attendees. What changes, obviously, in
That would be really
conversation-
challenging. It's like, wait, you can't
gosh,
cross the
yeah.
threshold, so you sign right here.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
That
I
would
don't,
be very
I
difficult.
don't know of many buyers who would be willing to
Yeah.
to sign that, right?
I'm going to turn
But
around.
I do think that, and Brian kind of touched on this when he talked about dual agency. I do think it's important to note that that answer kind of changes if we're talking about an unrepresented buyer who is going to the listing agent and seeking services. Now, where that's a whole it's a whole different ballgame.
And that gets into the importance of brokerage supervision and brokerage policy, where you've had that, obviously, the training up front, but also that conversation with the seller, because the last thing you want to do is alienate the relationship with the person you actually have fiduciary duties to. So making sure, I think it's important from the first perspective to say, okay, well, seller, this could happen. We may have unrepresented buyers that are coming through the property or seeking access to the property. And one thing that we've heard is, well, what if they approach me directly and they want to schedule a showing of the property? I don't think this is a matter of policy as well, but from the listing perspective, the seller is going to guide this. The seller is going to say, I'm not really comfortable with someone coming through the property without a licensee or without a professional with them. So obviously the alternative to that would be, you have access to the property, but it's going to be through an open house, or it's going to be through something where you have a licensee involved. That's important to note, because I think a lot of people are concerned that any behaviors by a brokerage that discourage access to a property could raise other obvious concerns. But from the seller's perspective, there are very strong reasons why they would not want an unrepresented buyer touring a property where the listing broker is sort of the chaperone, per se. So obviously the utility of open houses could become even more important.
But if I'm a listing agent and I get a call from an unrepresented buyer who sees the house with me, and then they go get representation and bring an offer, am I just a tool? Am I somebody who opens doors? No, or
I think it's important just to remember, it may feel that way, but it also, it may be emotionally satisfying to recognize the fact that, well, this buyer's now got professional representation, and my fiduciary duty to my seller is not in any way compromised or muddied by the persistent answers and questions and answers that would come from that. And I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it, when a buyer is using a professional representative, that enhances the level of professionalism in the transaction, hands down. So this idea that a listing broker would feel somehow used, or that they oh gosh, I thought that you would just come in and make an offer through your attorney or whomever it was. The problem there obviously is that leads to a whole nother set of considerations. You got lack of efficiency written all over that situation.
maybe implied dual agency or some kind of crazy construct like that.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, and we've talked a little bit about forums. We've touched on that. Now, I'm going to pretend that I am not chair of the forums presidential advisory group, and I'm going to ask you if Michigan Realtors is going to be providing updated forms for us.
Yeah, it's been a big question, and Becky and I have been working diligently with the forms PAG, and certainly the irony of all this is we sought to revise the bulk of our forms in advance of the settlement, sort of while the lawsuit was going on, and many of the changes to the forms that I mentioned earlier, we're going to roll out in mid-July. Those are going to be largely cosmetic in nature, because we already had language in there that said wholly negotiable and arguably stronger language.
Right.
But because of the settlement is so prescriptive, it's got to have that exact language, and it's got to be conspicuously placed. So the Forms PAG will be getting the band back together for one last review.
Next week, I think,
Next
is
week.
our review. And so, I think our target date for releasing the forms is, mid-July sometime. But I mean, they'll be out well in advance of that August 17th, practice change implementation date.
And I imagine we're going to see some videos right out of the studio telling us what to pay attention to on the forms.
Yeah, we tried to get in front of it to a degree to with the last couple of letters of the law, because obviously this concept of broker-to-broker compensation agreements, the idea of addendums to a purchase agreement that may seek to ask the seller for concessions or include compensation, those are all going to be, well, not novel concepts. They're going to be new forms, and so we'll roll those out with a discussion. It will be important to note, though, that this notion of, well, if associations are rolling out forms, what does that lead to in terms of uniformity? Everybody loves their own form, and that's something we've realized
That
very
was pretty
early
clear.
on. Yeah, and we have no doubt that while Michigan Realtors forms may serve as a template or something to sort of guide compliance, everybody's going to have their unique approach, and we're okay with that. That's why we are very careful about making sure that people understand the use of these forms is disclaimed from Michigan Realtors' perspective. But just the full suite of forms that you're going to see in mid-July, you'll see a new listing contract, you'll see a new exclusive buyer brokerage contract, you'll see a showing form,
and a broker-to-broker compensation agreement, and an updated seller concession addendum. I think that's...
Yep, and then the
I think that's
compensation
everything.
addendum as
Yep,
well.
a compensation addendum for the purchase agreement.
And just by way of thought process, addendums versus including it in the purchase agreement altogether, it will be important for the listing contract to contemplate whether the seller is comfortable asking for people to request concessions out of the gate, yes or no in the listing contract. But as far as the purchase agreement goes, it probably makes the most sense to have addendum that can augment the purchase agreement specific to those needs. Again, that's another example where transparency will be key, because you'll be walking that buyer client through that process, and the seller will be the listing broker will be walking their seller client through the types of offers that come in, the uniqueness of each offer.
Right. I think that, and again, coming back to, meeting the buyer where they are and having those clear, transparent conversations, the buyer should understand all the tools in their toolbox, and they should understand that we can ask for concessions, and then their agent can provide the concession addendum, if they want to ask for that during the transaction. So
Right.
Sounds like I should block a little bit more time for that meeting than I have allocated right now.
maybe.
So let's shift gears a little bit. My fellow realtors are of the entrepreneurial spirit in general. They
That's so true.
they will exceed at finding different ways to different business models, different ways to communicate compensation. Some may be within the guidelines, some may not. And what I heard you say earlier is that the MLS is going to be the responsible party, the adult in the room. What does that look like?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a challenge for the MLS, without a doubt. But I think NAR recognized that MLSs have had a system in place to address violations of MLS rules for a long time. And this is no different. It's going to be very important that people who are working coloring outside of the lines recognize that those MLS complaint processes may come to their doorstep very quickly. But more than that, I think that we've talked a lot about this is really going to demand everybody's attention. The MLSs are charged with enforcement, but I think associations are charged with education. Brokerages are charged with education, and making sure that we're not only trying to support the letter of the settlement, but also the spirit of the settlement. I don't think that infringes on entrepreneurship at all. I think entrepreneurship is the heart and soul of why realtors are going to thrive out of this settlement. But if the sort of idea is, how do I find the edges, or how do I work around it? I think that's wrong-headed, as we said at the outset. But
Something about pillows, writing out.
The pillows,
Can't do
the
that.
TikTok dances, and
Yeah.
I would point out too, that's important to remember, that the settlement is still subject to final approval by the court, and it could very well be that the Department of Justice issues a statement of interest if it appears after these rules go into effect. You know, if the optics look like realtors are just looking for ways to skirt around the rules, if it looks like the goal is to find ways to comply, you know, without actually complying, there's a lot of incentive there for Department of Justice intervention, and if that happens, we could be back to square one with a $5 billion jury verdict.
Right.
Arguably, the terms of the settlement are much more favorable than a $5 billion verdict.
To the misstep. And penalties for noncompliance?
That'll be up to local MLS discretion. It could look like fines. It could look like MLS privileges being revoked. But each MLS is going to be tasked with coming up with their own compliance policy and their own penalties.
Yeah. I gotta say, I think we're in great hands with the legal minds of Michigan Realtors helping us out here. It sounds like this is an opportunity to really raise the level of professionalism within our industry, the level of communication to our clients, and agent to agent, broker to broker.
Yeah, I agree. I think the value proposition that we always talk about is not just realtor centric. It's also, what are the associations doing? What are the MLSs doing? What are the brokerages doing to make sure that the standard of professionalism is as high as it's ever been? So we're up against the time, but I'm excited to have the next conversation down the road.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
See y'all next time.